Daniel thought he knew everything about his wife Sarah and his best friend Mark, until the day his world unraveled. What started as a typical evening returning home early from work soon became a nightmare when he discovered the devastating truth that both the woman he loved and the man he trusted had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. Secrets, lies, and a forbidden affair were just the beginning. Now Daniel must face the painful reality of how far they went to shatter his life. Sarah and Daniel had always been the perfect picture of suburban harmony. The house they had built together in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood was the epitome of what many people dreamed of. A cozy, welcoming home where everything seemed in its right place. They were a well-known couple in their small community, always exchanging pleasantries with neighbors and attending local gatherings. Daniel worked as a security guard at a nearby shopping mall, a job that offered him long hours and a steady paycheck. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough for him to provide for his family. Sarah, on the other hand, had always been the kind of woman who embraced her role as a stay-at-home mom. She adored their two young children, Jack and Emma, and took pride in caring for them. Her life revolved around managing the house, cooking meals, and making sure everything ran smoothly. On the surface, they seemed like an ideal couple. There were no major arguments, no glaring issues, just the quiet rhythm of family life. But as the months passed, Sarah began to feel the weight of her life pressing on her in ways she hadn't expected. The monotony of everyday routines, the endless chores, and the lack of excitement slowly started to wear on her. She loved her children, but there was a growing emptiness within her, a longing for something more than what her life had become. Daniel, for all his hard work, was often absent at night, working long shifts to ensure the mall remained safe. When he was home, he was tired, usually falling asleep on the couch after dinner or retreating into his routine. Their conversations had become repetitive, revolving around the children or trivial matters about the house. Sarah, once lively and full of dreams, now found herself trapped in a life that felt increasingly unfulfilling. She had always been the kind of person who thrived on connection, on feeling seen. But as the years passed, she began to feel invisible, not just to her husband, but to the world. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in the living room folding laundry, she glanced out the window and noticed a familiar face walking down the street. Mark, Daniel's longtime friend and co-worker, was passing by. She waved at him and he stopped for a brief chat. He had been a frequent visitor to their home for years, often stopping by to see Daniel after work or to borrow tools from the garage. He had always been friendly, easygoing, and easy to talk to. On this particular afternoon, however, the conversation with Mark felt different. There was something in the way he looked at her, a subtle shift in his demeanor that made her feel a spark, a momentary connection that she hadn't felt in a long time. As the conversation ended and Mark continued on his way, Sarah found herself thinking about the brief encounter long after he was gone. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Mark began talking more often, both in passing and through text messages. At first it was innocent, just casual exchanges about the kids or the weather. But soon their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Mark, too, seemed to be in a similar situation. He confided in Sarah about the troubles he was having in his own life, his own dissatisfaction with the direction things were going. They shared stories, laughed about their daily struggles, and began to lean on each other for emotional support. Sarah found herself looking forward to their talks, something she hadn't realized she had been missing for so long. The lines between friendship and something more began to blur. Sarah didn't expect it to happen, but she couldn't deny the attraction she felt toward Mark. It was as if he had come into her life at just the right moment, offering her something that had been missing for so long: attention, validation, and the kind of emotional connection that had slipped away from her marriage. She started to look forward to the moments when Daniel would leave for his night shifts, knowing that Mark might stop by or send her a message. The brief exchanges, at first innocent, soon turned into flirtations. Sarah knew she was playing with fire, but for the first time in years, she felt alive again. Mark was a welcome distraction from the loneliness that had crept into her life. Each secret message, each stolen moment, felt like a little rebellion against the life she had built with Daniel. She never intended for it to go further, never imagined it would become anything more than a brief escape. But as the weeks wore on, the connection between Sarah and Mark grew stronger, and what started as innocent flirting slowly spiraled into something much more dangerous. She was falling into a trap she hadn't seen coming, a trap she wasn't sure how to escape from anymore. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life as he always had, trusting that everything was fine at home. He had no reason to suspect that his perfect family was on the brink of unraveling. The quiet evenings, the mundane routines, seemed like the epitome of normalcy, but unbeknownst to him, Sarah was living a double life, and with each passing day the distance between them grew wider. The once solid foundation of their relationship was beginning to crack, but neither of them knew how to stop it. The first sign of trouble came when Daniel arrived home early from his shift one evening. He hadn't expected to be back until late, but a sudden change in his schedule had allowed him to finish his rounds sooner. As he walked up the driveway, he noticed something strange. The front door, which he always left locked for safety, was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but enough to make him pause. A flicker of unease rippled through him. He pushed the door gently and it creaked open, revealing the familiar interior of their home. Everything seemed fine at first, but a strange tension lingered in the air. "Sarah?" he called softly, but there was no response. He stepped inside, expecting to find her in the kitchen preparing dinner or in the living room with the kids, but the house was eerily quiet. It wasn't the usual warmth of a family home. There was a coldness to the air that unsettled him further. He made his way through the hallway, glancing around the house. His heart began to beat a little faster. His intuition, something he'd always trusted on the job, told him something wasn't right. The first thing he noticed was the faint scent in the air. It wasn't something he could place, but it was strong enough to make him stop and take a deep breath. It was floral, but too strong, like someone had overdone it with a perfume. The smell was a sharp contrast to the clean, familiar scent of their home. Daniel's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure why, but he had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, was out of place. He moved further into the house quietly, not wanting to alarm anyone. The kids were playing in the living room, their laughter filling the space. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. He didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps she was in another room or out back. But as he turned the corner into the living room, he spotted something on the couch. A long strand of blonde hair. It was unmistakable. He couldn't shake the chill that ran down his spine as he stared at it. Sarah's hair was brown, not blonde, and this strand didn't belong to her. Daniel froze, his mind racing. It was a small detail, insignificant to anyone else. But to him, it was a red flag. His gut twisted in a way it never had before. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a blonde hair in their house. Certainly not one like this, long and out of place. He picked it up carefully, his hand shaking slightly. It was too perfect, too deliberate. His heart began to pound. What was going on? Was someone else coming into their home when he wasn't there? He couldn't bring himself to jump to conclusions yet, so he put the hair aside and tried to push away the growing sense of dread. Maybe he was overreacting. But as he made his way through the house, checking on the children, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Everything seemed normal, but that small piece of evidence was nagging at him. Later that night, Sarah returned home after running errands, and Daniel tried to act as though everything was fine. He didn't mention the hair, choosing instead to watch her closely. She seemed distracted, more than usual. Her movements were quick, almost rushed, and she was avoiding eye contact. She seemed too eager to get to the kitchen to start dinner, to keep busy with anything other than conversation. Daniel, however, couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days were filled with a quiet tension. Sarah continued her usual routine, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the hair, about the strange way she had been acting. He began to pay closer attention to her behavior. Her frequent phone checks, the way she was always texting late into the night, the way she seemed increasingly unavailable. The conversations between them became more strained, less frequent. She would often retreat to the bedroom or sit alone in the living room, her face buried in her phone. Then there was the nagging thought that wouldn't leave Daniel's mind. The door had been left slightly ajar. Was it possible someone had been in the house? His mind jumped to all sorts of conclusions, but none of them felt like the right answer. He knew his wife. She had always been dependable, reliable. But now there was a distance between them that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't long before Daniel began to question everything he thought he knew. Had he missed something all this time? Was Sarah hiding something from him? Or worse, was she lying about where she went and who she spent time with? The thought of betrayal, of infidelity, was too much to bear. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only explanation that made sense. It wasn't just the hair. It wasn't just the scent in the air. It was the little things, small moments that added up, the behavior he hadn't noticed before. And now, as he watched her go through the motions of everyday life, he wondered if he had been blind to the truth all along. For the first time, Daniel considered the possibility that his perfect life wasn't so perfect after all. Daniel's worst fears were realized the day he decided to take matters into his own hands. The unsettling feeling that had been building over the past few weeks had reached a tipping point. The hair on the couch, the strange scent in the air, and Sarah's increasing distance were all too much for him to ignore. He had trusted his instincts before, and now, his gut told him that something was terribly wrong. He had to know the truth, even if it shattered everything he thought he knew about his marriage. It started with a decision that would haunt him for days to come. He installed a hidden camera in the living room. At first, the idea felt invasive, almost like an act of betrayal itself. But as the days went by, Daniel justified it to himself. He wasn't spying on Sarah, not exactly. He just needed to know. The camera, tucked away in the corner, was small enough to go unnoticed, and he made sure it blended in with the surroundings. It was his last attempt at gathering evidence before confronting her, and deep down he feared that confronting her without the truth would leave him empty-handed, vulnerable. The first few days after the camera was set up were filled with anxious anticipation. Daniel would return from his shifts eager to review the footage, but at the same time, terrified of what he might find. He had convinced himself that there was no way Sarah could be involved in something that serious. But deep down, the gnawing feeling never left. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the long strand of blonde hair, about the scent in the air, and about the way Sarah had been acting. He needed to be sure. It wasn't until the third night that Daniel finally mustered the courage to watch the footage. His heart raced as he clicked through the video, watching the empty living room at first, nothing but the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. But then, something happened that would change everything. At 11:43 p.m., Sarah walked into the frame, her movements smooth, almost rehearsed. She was wearing a black coat, something she never wore when just hanging around the house. She checked over her shoulder as she entered the living room, her eyes darting around nervously. It didn't make sense. Sarah wasn't someone who was paranoid or secretive. But here she was, acting like she was trying to hide something. Daniel's pulse quickened. Within minutes, the doorbell rang. and Sarah hurriedly opened the door to reveal none other than Mark, Daniel's best friend, his confidant, the person he trusted the most. Mark stepped inside quickly, casting a quick glance over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. The two exchanged a brief tense hug before Sarah led him into the living room, shutting the door behind them with an almost exaggerated care. Daniel's stomach dropped as he continued watching, barely able to breathe. He had no idea what to expect, but the sight of Sarah and Mark together in their home, acting as if they were sharing some secret, was enough to break his heart. He watched them laugh at something Sarah said, their body language relaxed. Too relaxed for two people who were merely friends. It wasn't just a friendship. They were close, too close. Daniel had always seen the bond between them, but this was something else entirely. Minutes later, the tension in the air thickened. Mark leaned in toward Sarah, his hand lightly brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him with a softness in her eyes that Daniel had never seen before. They spoke quietly, but it didn't take much to understand what was happening. There was something between them, something intimate, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Then, as if the universe had conspired to reveal the truth all at once, Sarah kissed Mark. It was slow, hesitant at first, but there was no denying what was happening. The kiss lingered long enough for Daniel to feel the sting of betrayal seep deep into his bones. Mark was no longer just his friend. He was the man who had crossed a line that could never be undone. Daniel's mind raced as he watched the rest of the footage. The two of them didn't stop there. Over the course of the next hour, they shared more intimate moments. Whispers, touches, and soft laughter that seemed so out of place in the home Daniel had built. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was real. They weren't just sharing an affair. They were sharing a life that Daniel had no idea existed. It was a world of secrets and lies, one that he had been living in blind ignorance of, thinking everything was fine. By the time the footage ended, Daniel felt numb. He couldn't move, couldn't process what he had just seen. The pain, the shock, the disbelief, they all merged into a heavy weight that crushed him from the inside. Mark, the man he had considered his closest friend, had betrayed him. Sarah, his wife, had betrayed him. His entire world was falling apart. He sat there in the silence of the room, staring at the screen. The images burned into his mind. He had found the truth, but the truth had shattered everything. How could this have happened? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why hadn't he seen the signs? The answers didn't come immediately. Instead, all Daniel could do was sit there, haunted by the faces of the two people he had trusted the most in the world. People who had taken his trust and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. The truth was out there, but the cost of knowing it was more than he could bear. The weight of what Daniel had discovered sat heavily on his chest in the days that followed. The betrayal was sharp and immediate, but even more painful was the realization that it had been happening right under his nose. The hidden camera had revealed the truth, but it felt like a cruel twist of fate that it was his best friend, Mark, who had become the architect of his misery. Every time Daniel tried to clear his mind, images from the footage played over and over in his head. Sarah and Mark laughing together, their stolen glances, the kiss that sealed the betrayal. The trust he'd built with both of them had crumbled in an instant, leaving him in a fog of confusion, anger, and disbelief. For the first few days, Daniel didn't confront Sarah. He couldn't. He wasn't ready to face the woman he'd spent years of his life with, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. Instead, he stayed up late, staring at the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't just the affair that shook him. It was the calculated way they'd kept it hidden, The fact that they had gone to such lengths to keep things a secret, using the house, using his trust, made it all the more painful. There were whispers of betrayal in every corner of their home. Their children played in the living room where Mark had kissed Sarah, where they had shared moments Daniel would never get back. The thought of it was suffocating, but as the days wore on, Daniel knew he couldn't keep running from the truth. He had to confront Sarah. He couldn't go on pretending everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. When he came home from his shift one evening, Sarah was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. She looked up at him and gave him a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something about the way she looked at him, distant and uneasy, made his stomach twist. She knew. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, trying to steady his voice. "We need to talk." Her expression shifted, becoming tense. She set the magazine down and turned to face him. For a brief moment, Daniel saw her face flicker with something. Guilt, maybe. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a calm that he knew was a facade. She was trying to act like everything was fine, like she hadn't just shattered their entire life with her lies. "I know," she said softly, almost as if she had been expecting this moment. "You've been acting strange, Daniel. What's going on?" His heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. "I know about you and Mark." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of the accusation. Sarah's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak but faltered. She knew there was no denying it anymore. Daniel could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the shame. But there was something else too. A hint of fear. She hadn't expected him to find out like this. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, but Daniel could hear the crack in her voice. It wasn't the first time she'd said those words, but this time, they felt empty. "It just happened." Daniel could feel his anger rising, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "How long, Sarah?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "How long has this been going on?" Her eyes shifted, and for a moment Daniel thought she might try to lie, but then she exhaled deeply, as if resigned to the truth. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "A few months." Daniel's mind reeled. For months he had been living in a lie, sharing his life with a woman who had been sharing herself with someone else. He felt like the ground beneath him was slipping away. The anger bubbled up, but the betrayal cut deeper. He had trusted her with everything, and she had taken it all for granted. The love, the years they had spent together, the life they had built. It was all nothing more than a facade. "And Mark?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with emotion. "How could he do this to me, Sarah? How could he do this to us?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked truly broken. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake, Daniel. It was a mistake I regret so much." Daniel's fists clenched. She was sorry now, but that didn't change what had happened. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "A mistake?" Daniel repeated, his voice rising. "This wasn't just a mistake, Sarah. You didn't just trip and fall into this. You chose this. You chose him over me, over our family." Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. "I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. I just..." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I just felt so lonely, Daniel. I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't know what else to do." Daniel's heart twisted. He could see the pain in her eyes, but it didn't soften the anger he felt. "So, you turned to Mark?" he asked bitterly. "My best friend?" I didn't think it would go this far, Sarah said, her voice breaking. But once it started, I didn't know how to stop it. I'm so sorry. But Daniel couldn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. The pieces of his life had been shattered, and he had no idea how to pick them up again. The betrayal had gone deeper than just the affair. It wasn't just the intimacy between Sarah and Mark. It was the trust that had been broken, the foundation of their marriage that had crumbled under the weight of lies. I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel said, his voice trembling with emotion. He didn't want to feel this way, but it was the truth. His heart ached, and every word he spoke felt like a knife twisting deeper into his soul. Sarah reached out for him, but Daniel pulled away, unable to let her touch him. She had crossed a line that he wasn't sure could ever be crossed back. The life they had built was gone, and now all he could do was stand in the ruins of it, unable to fathom where they would go from here. There were no answers, no easy fixes. Only the painful truth that his world had been ripped apart and he didn't know how to rebuild it. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and anger. Daniel had expected his world to come crashing down, but the reality of it felt even worse than he had imagined. Sarah's apology, though sincere in her eyes, did little to ease the rawness of the hurt he was feeling. She had made her choice, and there was no undoing it. No amount of regret could change the fact that she had betrayed him with Mark, someone who had been his closest friend for years. It was a betrayal on two fronts, one that left him with nothing but the hollow ache of lost trust. The atmosphere in their home was suffocating. Daniel felt like a stranger in his own life. Every room, every corner of the house seemed to carry the weight of what had happened. The living room, where he'd once shared laughter and quiet evenings with his family, now felt like a battlefield. Even the children's laughter, which had once brought him so much joy, felt like a distant echo, as if it belonged to another life altogether. Sarah tried to talk, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but Daniel wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. He couldn't bring himself to engage in the emotional tug-of-war that Sarah seemed determined to initiate. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to understand why everything had gone so wrong, but no matter how many questions he asked, there were no real answers. No explanation could justify the depth of the betrayal. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself alone in his own home, not just physically, but emotionally. Sarah had retreated to her own space, unsure of how to fix what was irreparably broken, and Daniel had withdrawn into a shell of quiet suffering. The distance between them had become palpable, like a wall that neither of them knew how to tear down. The hardest part was confronting Mark. He had been Daniel's best friend for so long, someone he trusted with his deepest secrets, someone he had shared countless memories with. But now, every time he thought about Mark, a sickening wave of betrayal washed over him. He had to confront him. He had to know why. One evening, after a long shift, Daniel went to Mark's apartment. He had debated the decision for days, wrestling with the idea of facing the man who had shattered his life. But it was a conversation he needed to have, even if it tore him apart. Mark answered the door with an expression that shifted quickly from confusion to guilt when he saw Daniel standing there. He tried to offer a smile, but it was hollow, a poor attempt to mask the tension between them. I don't even know where to begin, Daniel, Mark said, his voice tight. Daniel stepped into the apartment, his fists clenched at his sides. You don't get to explain anything to me, he said, the anger bubbling to the surface. How could you do this? How could you betray me like this? Mark looked away, his eyes avoiding Daniel's. I never wanted to hurt you, man. He broke off, his voice faltering. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Didn't mean for it to go this far? Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. You slept with my wife, Mark. My wife. This wasn't some mistake. You knew exactly what you were doing. You were my friend. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his face contorting with guilt. I know, Daniel. I know. And I hate myself for it. I've been trying to figure out how to make this right, but I don't know how. I never wanted to hurt you, but Sarah, she came to me. She needed someone to talk to, and I let it go too far. I was stupid. I messed everything up. Daniel shook his head, the anger still boiling in his veins. You don't get to apologize, Mark. You don't get to mess with my life and then just say you're sorry. That's not how this works. Mark took a step forward, his face full of regret. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know I never intended to ruin your life. I don't know what happened. It's not like I wanted any of this. Daniel could feel the frustration building. He had no interest in hearing excuses. There were no words Mark could say that would make this right. No apology would change the fact that Mark had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. You've already ruined everything, Daniel said through gritted teeth. And you can just come here and act like it's all going to be okay. You don't get to apologize for this. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. Mark stood there, silent, as if the weight of Daniel's words had knocked the breath out of him. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Daniel couldn't bear to listen. There was nothing more to say. As Daniel turned to leave, he realized just how empty everything felt. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by people he thought he could trust, only to find that those very people had betrayed him. Mark had been a brother to him, and Sarah had been his partner. But now, both were strangers in his life, and the future ahead of him felt uncertain and bleak. He left Mark's apartment without looking back, his mind consumed by the overwhelming sense of loss. He knew the road ahead would be long and painful. He didn't know if he could ever repair the damage done to his marriage, or even if he wanted to. Sarah's betrayal had torn a hole in his heart, one that he wasn't sure could ever heal. And Mark's role in it all left him with a bitterness that would likely linger for years. As he walked back to his car, Daniel couldn't help but feel a deep emptiness inside him. The people he trusted most had betrayed him, and now he was left alone, forced to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. It would take time, maybe even a lifetime, to rebuild what had been lost. But the truth was clear. Some wounds never fully heal, and some betrayals change everything, forever.